I'm not a cop, but my boss used to be one, and he told me this. Cops get called to check up on a guy who hasn't shown up to work in a few days, and his family haven't heard from him either. They show up to his apartment and stumble across him. He shot himself in the face. There was blood everywhere, alcohol bottles. The gunshot or impact or something had even blown his eyes out. It was a really horrible mess. Apparently, he had gotten real drunk and decided to kill himself. The boss calls it in, and him and a few others who were called in are waiting for the coroner or whoever is supposed to come in and do all that cop stuff. They're waiting in the doorway to this bedroom, just kind of shooting the shit. And all of a sudden, this dead guy just sits up in bed and starts attempting to talk. This guy, who looked dead, hole in his fucking face, eyes gone, blood everywhere, sits up and starts mumbling. My boss, who had done tactical training with the FBI, said he scared him so much he almost drew his gun and shot the guy thinking he was a zombie or something. Turns out, he hadn't shot himself in a vital way, like some Fight Club stuff or something. My boss wasn't very specific on that. He had drank so much and was probably so doped up from the script pills that he had no idea what happened. Mind you, he had only shot himself the night prior. He hadn't been lying in bed for a few days bleeding out. I can only imagine what would race through my head if a guy who looked dead in every sense of the word just stood up while I was off guard and started groaning and mumbling. Truly scary stuff. The scariest call I've ever had was a medical call involving a 3-year-old girl. My first department I worked for required all officers to be first responder certified. Basic medical training, not enough to be an EMT or medic, but above first aid. We would normally respond to medical calls until the EMTs arrived just to secure the scene. This particular call came as a 3-year-old girl having a seizure. The location of the call was at a large hotel/resort. I worked at a beach. The closest vehicle access was the front entrance, and I had to go on foot to the actual room. When I pulled up to the front, dispatch upgraded the call and informed the girl had just gone into cardiac arrest. I started running to the room, which was nowhere near the front of the hotel, and after finding it, the family was in complete hysterics. I saw the little girl on the ground in the kitchen, who was still seizing. However, you could see that her face was turning blue. The mom grabbed me and started screaming at me to save her daughter. I hadn't performed CPR since the academy. I told the mom and everyone to go out into the hallway and for someone to run into the front to guide the EMTs when they arrived. Suddenly, it was now just me and the girl in the room. The gravity of the situation suddenly hit me. There was no way EMS would be able to get there in time to help her. I paused for about 10 seconds and just tried to collect myself, or froze up. It's cliche, but those 10 seconds felt like an absolute eternity. Somehow I snapped out of it and began CPR. Amazingly, with the first compression, she suddenly let out a giant cough and started breathing again. I've been a police officer for 5 years now, responded to countless fatal wrecks, shootings, stabbings, murder scenes, etc. But nothing was as scary as sitting there on the floor next to that girl knowing if I didn't do something that she was going to die. I've shared this story before. Searching the house was definitely one of the scariest things I've done. I've been a cop for a while now, and this is one of the calls that still haunts me. I guess a call for a domestic assault that had just occurred, and I learned that the victim is in the neighbor's house. I get there, and find the female victim's throat had been cut from ear to ear. The neighbor is holding a towel up to her slit throat, and the victim is struggling to breathe. The paramedics are on their way, and I take over holding the towel for the neighbour. I'm trying to apply enough pressure to reduce the bleeding, but not so much pressure that I'm strangling her. It was a delicate balance. Quick law lesson. You know that there are laws against hearsay, right? Basically, I can't testify in court about the events that someone else told me about and I didn't witness. The person who witnessed it would have to testify to it. One of the exceptions is what's known as the dying declaration. If someone is on their deathbed and believes that they are about to die, their statements are exempt from the hearsay rules. I have some serious doubts that this woman is going to live. I want to ask her who slit her throat. In order for it to qualify as a dying declaration, I need to be able to testify that she believes she was about to die. So I asked her 2 questions. The first was, "Who cut your throat?" which she answered. The second was, "You realize that you may be about to die?" which she answered, "Yes." Our eyes were locked, and I still remember the emptiness in her eyes. Within a few minutes, the medic showed up, and my partner and I went next door to look for the suspect. The door was ajar, and we could hear a baby screaming upstairs. We went in with guns drawn, and the metallic smell of blood was overpowering. We made our way upstairs, past smeared bloody handprints on the walls, and found the child upstairs. He was unharmed, and the suspect was long gone. Thanks to the excellent performance of the medical staff, the victim survived. I met with her a couple of weeks later, and I was very apprehensive to speak with her again. I had basically looked at her and told her she was going to die. When she opened the door, I could tell that she didn't recognize me. She had very little memory of what happened after she was assaulted. I told her who I was, and she hugged me and thanked me for saving her life. The suspect ended up pleading guilty, so I never had to testify as to what I had told the victim that night. It still haunts me to this day. This happened to a friend of mine. He was a state trooper and had been for years. One night, he pulls over a guy who was swerving a bit. He didn't really suspect DUI, but he wanted to be sure. He pulls him over and calls in the plates and goes to talk to the guy, get his license, etc. As soon as he turned around, the guy pulled a gun and got out. My friend turned back to find himself staring down the barrel of this guy's handgun with no way out. He soon learnt of this guy's warrant and how he wasn't going back. The guy got him down on his knees. The guy keeps talking for a minute and then goes to execute him. He pulls the trigger with the gun held to my friend's head, and it jams. The gun does not go off. He quickly subdues the man and arrests him. The guy is laying on the ground crying. My friend gets back up and this guy goes to prison. My friend was never able to return to patrols. He would freak whenever he had to pull someone over. It ended his career. Years later, he went to prison and met the guy and forgave him for that night. I guess to get closure. I watched a man die in front of his children while his wife screamed at us to bring him back. He had taken his own life after putting the kids to bed. I heard his last breath, this slow death rattle, and while I was holding the bag of fluid for the paramedics, a large glob of bile came out of his mouth and landed on my cheek. I'll never forget the screams of those kids as long as I live. Even now I'm holding back tears. No high-risk, high-drama, armed and dangerous situation will ever scare me more than the sound of a wife screaming with her children as their husband and dad breathes his last, long, craggy breath in front of them. I will never forget those screams. This isn't my story, but my history teacher told my class this story about his brother, who's a cop in the Twin Cities. He got a call about a noise complaint at a party on Halloween night. Nothing major. He shows up at the party, which is on the rooftop of an apartment building. He can already hear music blaring from where the party was. Suddenly, he saw a blur of movement coming from the roof, and then heard a splash. When he checked it out, he discovered this. A teenager at the party had gotten drunk and jumped off the roof, landing head first. The impact broke his neck in multiple places, and his head was shoved into his chest cavity, from the nose down. I have two stories from a former teacher of mine. Story 1. He responded to an assault where a woman's boyfriend killed her and then dragged her daughter out into the woods and beat her head in with a rock. He was the first responder, and the man fled the scene, so he was focused on saving the girl. But he couldn't. She was 9 years old and watched the life drain from her eyes. He said that was the worst thing he's ever seen. Holding a little girl in his arms as her breathing stops and her irises turn grey. Story 2. He gets a phone call and the sergeant says, "You need to get down here. It's John. Something's happened." John was his partner and best friend at the time. So as he's speeding down to go to where the sergeant told him to go, he calls multiple people asking them what happened, but they won't tell him. When he arrives at the scene, he sees John's cruiser completely destroyed and charred. He pushes through the paramedics, hoping to see John on a stretcher, but he's not. So he looks into the wrecked cruiser and sees a charred, burnt lump. At that moment, he realized that he was looking at his best friend, who was completely unrecognizable. I'm not a cop, but my co-worker's father is, and he hit me with this whopper of a story once. For some background reference, I live in Austin, and all these occurrences were with the Austin Police Department and happened in 1978. An APD officer pulled over a blue Mustang for not having a rear license plate. A man and a woman are inside. The officer tries to run the couple through dispatch, but the system's down, so he lets them go with a citation. After letting them go, however, dispatch lets them know that the man has an outstanding warrant. The officer pulled the couple back over, and the man, David Lee Powell, knew his arrest was imminent. Crawling into the back seat, he loads his AK-47 and opened fire as the cop approached. Mortally wounded, the officer called for backup before dying on the side of the road. Officer Villegas, my co-worker's father, hears on the radio that an officer is down only 8 blocks away, and takes off straight from where he thinks the killer is headed, the highway. Before arriving, however, he finds a blue Mustang in an apartment complex parking lot with its lights turned off, cruising at a really low speed. He peels into the parking lot, blocking the only exit off, and called for backup. Then a storm of bullets pound his police car, some from Powell's AK-47, some from his lady accomplice's pistol. As they're exchanging fire, Powell hurls a small oval-sized object towards the front of Officer Villegas' police cruiser. To the officer's horror, it was a hand grenade, and he was sure his death was imminent. He explained his last thought being of his wife and kids, and how he was so sad he wouldn't be able to see them again, and that being the scariest moment in his 38 years on the force. But the grenade didn't go off, and Powell and his lady friend were out of ammo. As backup arrived, Powell took off between the apartment complex into the woods, whereas the lady accomplice attempted to hide in the ditch. Seeing her in the ditch attempting to reload, Officer Villegas ran up to her and kicked her square in the face, shattering her jaw. Powell was later caught in the woods after a manhunt and received the death penalty for his actions that day.